Sorry about the delay, everybody. We're just waiting for one more person for the committee to get quorum. We'll be right with you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Quincy, Chair of the Ways and Means Committee, and this is the regularly scheduled meeting of the committee. And we're joined by committee members Johnson, Bender, Palmisano. I know Councilmember Yang is unavailable today as he's at a settlement conference for the city. And I'm sure Council Vice President Glidden will be joining us soon. I also wanted to point out that we're joined by Council Members Goodman and Reich, as we're going to have the Budget Committee meeting immediately following the Ways and Means Committee. So we just begin today with the 30 items on the Ways and Means consent agenda. The first item is a legal settlement from the City Attorney's Office. We also have a contract amendment with Kirby Kennedy for court reporting. City Coordinator Office brings forward a grant application for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The Convention Center brings forward the bid for messenger construction for Convention Center Exhibit Hall entry fronts and a bid for Huffer Corp. Inc. for Minneapolis Convention Center operable wall partition replacement. Finance and Property Services Department has a contract amendment with Iowa and Associates Corporation for the Fridley Softening Plant. Contract amendment with Morecon Construction for elevator upgrade. Contract for architectural and engineering services with Wald Architects for fire stations 4 and 8 renovations. We have a HUD 2016 consolidated plan final department allocations. This is also a contract with FR Secure Information Security Consulting. Information Technology Department brings forward a contract with Insight Public Sector for ongoing software and workflow support services, as well as a contract amendment with DeltaWorks LLC for continued support services. IGR Department brings forward a contract amendment with Fagri BD Consulting for federal representation services. Public Works Department brings forward another item for the Fridley Filter Plant Rehabilitation Project. This is a license agreement with Anoka County. From the Community Development Regulatory Services Committee, we have the Director's Fee Schedule amendment. We also have a 2015 Tax Increment Finance Report. The Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee brings forward a grant from Hennepin County for contraception services through the School-Based Clinics Program. Grant for Centers for Disease Control for prevention of teen dating violence and youth violence. Community Wellness Contract Amendments. We also have a joint powers agreement and a memorandum of understanding for youth curfew and truancy services. The Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee brings forward a contract with the University of Minnesota Veterinary Clinic for vet services. MOU for Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C. for police officer participation in Presidential Inauguration Task Force. We have travel expense donation acceptance from Major Cities Chiefs Association, the custom door gift acceptance for Aaron Carlson Corporation, security film and labor gift acceptance for C-Bond and Sun Control of Minnesota, grant acceptance from the state of Minnesota 4th Judicial District Court for police liaison and monitoring services, a grant acceptance from the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, and a grant acceptance from the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, Homeland Security, and Emergency Management Division for the Emergency Management Preparedness Grants. We also postponed from last cycle, we have the Advanced Metering Infrastructure Request for Proposals. That item has gone through the Permanent Review Committee, so that's been approved. So I'm going to put that on the consent agenda for approval. And then the Nicollet Central Modern Streetcar Project. This is for a consulting contract amendment, and rather than passing that in this committee, what we're going to do is return that to the Transportation and Public Works Committee so they can take appropriate actions for its continuation. So with those 30 items on the consent agenda for approval and the number 30 being returned to TPW, any questions or comments? Not seeing any. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed, and that items are all carried. That actually concludes the business of the Ways and Means Committee. So I'll have that committee adjourned, and then we're beginning the first of our budget committee hearings. This is the receiving the Mayor's 2017 recommended budget overview presentation. And this will be for the full committee, which is the full council. And this will be an overview presentation of the mayor's recommended budget. It'll include lots of opportunity for questions from committee members. And we'd just like to invite Mr. Ruff up if you'd like to kick it off, kind of outline what we're going to do. I don't know how long exactly you have planned, Mr. Ruff, but I know that there's a number of breaks in the presentation. So if we could kind of hold our questions for the end of a section, we'll be able to answer those questions and then move on to the next one. Feel free to ask those along the way by just waving your hand. Mr. Ruff, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Mark Ruff. I'm the city's Chief Financial Officer. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the committee for the opportunity to speak before you. As you know, I have been here all of 5 months, and I think speaks well, especially of the staff in the Finance and Property Services division, that they feel confident enough in me that I could be the spokesperson after 5 months. It means that we have very good staff. Latonia Green heads up our budget effort. Really want to say thank you to Latonia and her staff. I also want to especially express my gratitude to the mayor and her staff. As she has told you, she takes this budget process very seriously, and I have seen firsthand. She takes more detailed notes than I do on all of these things, and it's a very impressive process that the city follows. And I also want to say just my gratitude to the departments as well. The presentations that were made before the mayor in all of the departments were very thoughtful, and as you as a budget committee will also have the benefit of those presentations as we move forward in this fall. As Chair Quincy mentioned, we're going to pause after certain major sections of this presentation. I would also say that if there is necessary clarity or if I skipped over something too quickly in the presentation, because we will be running through some of these slides very quickly, please don't hesitate for me to stop and go back over a slide I may have not sufficiently or adequately described. The highlights the mayor described in her budget address. It is a 5.5% levy increase, and we have to remember that the city's budget overall, including everything being city controlled, is about $1.3 billion. We have other boards and commissions which takes that number over closer to $1.4 billion. Right, so it's a very large budget. The levy is something more than $300 million. So the levy receives an outsized, in my opinion, attention in terms of what drives city revenues and expenses over the long term. Nevertheless, 5.5% levy increase is a number that's slightly higher than what was agreed to by the City Council, agreed to in the sense of what was underlying the agreement with the Parks and Streets earlier this spring. So if you recall, the number that was described at that time was about 4.9% levy increase that was anticipated. Obviously, some of our revenues have changed, some of our expenses have changed. But that was a 1% operating levy increase as well as $30 million in new capital spending. The 0.5% additional or 0.6% additional really is due to a couple of things. One is we are not seeing certain revenues increasing as we expected, and also just the increase in public safety that's associated with the mayor's budget. Because of the attention on the levies, I'll just turn your specific focus into the different components of the levy. As we mentioned, the general fund is a substantial part of the city's overall budget. That portion of the levy is $176 million. The overall levy for 2017 is just under $314 million. The Park Board is a substantial increase, so in addition to the $3 million of new operating that was associated with the agreement earlier this spring, there is also just the inflation on the Park Board generally, which goes into that number as well. So you can see the overall levy increase for the Park Board is $5.4 million. So that's the $3 million plus an additional $2.4 million for inflation and other budgetary costs. Our general bond redemption number is staying the same. That's the overall net debt bond number. You'll say, well, where is the capital cost associated with the streets and the parks? Well, we are issuing bonds this year, but we are not starting to increase the levy until 2018. So when I say this year, I mean 2017 will be the time that we'll incur debt for some of those new improvements. We'll start increasing the levy for those in 2018. and 18. The other of significance, the 595 is just a reallocation of levy. It's not a cut in spending, but the Permanent Improvement Fund is a reduction of $500,000. That's the fund that help underlies many public works and other major projects. It is a revolving fund. We have been working with Public Works to create a little more discipline in that process. We think we can afford $500,000 less in levy. The pension $5 million drop was again part of the discussion of the Parks and Streets. We are, because of the good work that was done by this council, previous councils, the amount that we have to pay the state of Minnesota for our closed pension funds is at least budgeted for this year $5 million less. The rest of the levies remain largely the same, and we will touch on a few of them a little bit later in the presentation. Any questions on the levy?
Not seeing any. Oh, we've got one. Councilmember Goodman.
Ask.
Sure.
I never, this is always new to me, as old as it is. I'm just wondering if you could reiterate. So there's going to be a general fund increase in expenditure of $16 million. What amount of that is for the roads plan?
Largely, the $16 million increase in the general fund is not associated with the parks and the streets. The $3 million increase, which is in the operating budgets, is in the park line item. Mm-hmm. The $16 million levy increase will be shown later in the context of the whole general fund levy, so it's probably better to answer that question in the general fund budget process rather than just isolating that one function. Because, again, the levy in the general fund is only a small component of the overall general fund revenues.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Ruff, so where does the spending for roads fall then?
This year, the components of the road funding will be paid for by reduced levy from the pension, so $5 million reduced levy pension. Okay. There is cash, which is being drawn from other funds. If you recall, there was a discussion of bringing cash in from the convention center fund that will help pay for that. And then there are bond issues, which are being issued in 2017, but the debt service on those will not be paid until 2018. So the increased debt service is not in the 2017 budget.
So 100% of the money for roads does not come out of the general fund levy?
For 2017, it will come out of the general fund levy in future years.
So there's a breakdown somewhere else in this report of what the $16 million or 10% increase in spending the city is doing. There's going to be a breakdown somewhere else in this presentation?
So there will be a description in the context of the general fund, yes, Councilmember.
Okay, Mr. Chair, because we're saying, okay, we're not spending any more money, except for we're spending $16 million or 10% more in the general fund, so we are spending more money, and to have this assertion that it's all coming for parks and roads is not really true, since the parks and roads portion could have been done without an increase in the levy, it sounds like, at least for next year.
Mr. Ruff, if you could describe the continuing service levels and what the planned increase was anyway.
Right, and Mr. Chair, I think it's better done in the context of the whole general fund presentation, if that's appropriate. I understand the question completely.
And you'll answer it within that part portion.
I will, Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Anything else? Not seeing anything. Thank you, Mr. Ruff.
So I mentioned the public safety spending. Here is a quick overview of the public safety spending. We will go into greater detail on later slides. But it is both police and fire increased spending. There is also in the mayor's recommended budget $2.7 million in cuts, primarily that is revolving around healthcare, which is not a cut to services of our employees or healthcare benefits our employees. It's a recognition of what's happened over the last few years in the budget, that we are showing lower usage of the healthcare budget, mainly because we have less family usage and more individual coverage that is used by employees.
Go ahead, Ms. Goodman.
Entire day. So why are we calling it a strategic cut then? It's not a cut, it's a reduction in an expenditure. We're making it sound like, yay, us, we cut something. But this isn't cutting anything. This is just a service reduction. Cost reduction in services.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, there is $700,000 of department cuts as well. So this was a term that was used in the budget process.
To spin it into looking like we're cutting something. So we're cutting a little bit. $2 million is savings and $700,000 is a reduction in something across every department in the city.
Mr. Chair, Council Member Goodman, there will be reductions in every department's budget associated with the healthcare costs.
Because we're giving them less health care, or because the cost to give that same health care went down?
Mr. Chair, Council Member Goodman, the latter.
So it's not a cut. Okay, just want to be clear. We're trying to be transparent for people about what the budget is. To say there's a $2.7 million in cuts is not true. There's a $2 million savings and a $700,000 cut across all departments.
Councilmember Quincy, move on. Thank you. General fund. So we talked about the budget generally as $1 billion, just over $1.3 billion. To me, it's easier to parse out the budget into different components. We have the general fund, we have the enterprise funds, we have special revenue funds. So we're going to focus first on the general fund. This chart is just to give a sense of why in part is the levy increasing by 10% for the general fund. And part of that is a function of the fact that if you look 15 years ago, we had state aids which were over 41%. So this chart, the blue at the bottom, are LGA, or local government aid, coming from the state of Minnesota. The gray in the middle is the share of the budget that is the property tax levy, and then the green are other revenues lumped together. So we can see for 2017, the levy is increasing as an overall percentage of the budget from 33 to 35. LGA is flat, and the other revenues are being reduced as well. The general fund is just under $500 million. It's about a third of the total budget. This particular chart helps to answer, I think, Councilmember Goodman's earlier question, which is what's happening with spending overall. Overall, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
I think we had a question from Councilmember Bender, but I was just checking. Councilor Goodman, did you have a question? Okay, I heard you down there. Okay, Councilmember Bender, would you like to ask your question now?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the previous slide, I just think it's important to note here, 2 slides back. So when I had a briefing about the budget, the assumption was that there was some uncertainty about our level of local government aid related to the legislature, and it seems like now that question has been answered. So we will not be receiving the extra LGA that would have been included in a tax bill unless there's some special session that happens, very quickly here. And so I think it's maybe important to highlight here that when we passed the budget, in the past we have assumed that there would be more LGA, and now it seems very clear that there won't be that amount of money, so we have to accommodate our budget accordingly. Just didn't want to miss that point.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, you're exactly right. So a breakdown of different revenues that go into the general fund. You can see the first 4 categories are actually decreasing, which is part of the reason we have to increase the tax levy. You can see the overall general fund revenues is up 2%. Part of that is a function of what Councilmember Bender just mentioned, which is our local government aid. We are forecasting at a $100,000 increase, so really nominal. And the rest of the first 4 categories are internal charges, fines and forfeits, which I think we're all happy that they're actually decreasing, but that is a lower revenue source. Franchise fees are essentially the tax we pass along in terms of electric, gas, and some of the cable franchises as well is decreasing. And license and permits, despite the fact that we have a very robust economic activity in the city, is actually going down. For example, in that category is lane use fees that we charge public and private for blocking parts of the right-of-way. We are seeing a significant decrease in those revenues. So part of this is a function of what has happened in the past, which is we had seen growth in these particular areas of significance. I think there was a discussion in previous budget cycles about this term right-sizing, which is bringing up the revenue expectations for what the historical revenues have been in some of these categories. What we're seeing now is that curve is peaked and starting to come down a little bit. So when you have a budget that needs to increase just basic inflation without any additional types of enhancements to that budget, and we have revenues which are either flat or declining, it's going to put more pressure on the tax levy. Hence, in this case, the two areas where we were able to see more revenue increases are the property taxes and the sales and entertainment taxes. So sales and entertainment tax, we are going to see some benefit coming out of U.S. Bank Stadium. We do estimate that that benefit will be in the neighborhood of $2 million. During the Parks and Streets, we had talked about at least $1 million, and that was counted on to help pay for some of that cost. But there is certainly the gap that is typically filled is with property taxes. So that's part of what the pressure is. So again, general fund 10%, but overall levy increase 5.5% when we factor in all the other levies that were in the earlier chart. Again, pausing for questions in this particular arena.
Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you please explain the fund transfers from 4.0 in 2016 to 12.5 in 2017?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Cano, the $4 million is from the parking fund. So the parking fund makes more money than is necessary to just operate the municipal ramps and the parking system. And so historically that has been transferred into the general fund to help write down property taxes. That number was increased from $4 million to $7 million for 2017. So again, as a way of trying to hold down the levy, we did increase the fund transfers. There are also, those last two categories have traditionally funded some capital, in particular the use of fund balance. As the council is aware, we don't like to have structural deficits within our operating budgets. We don't like to use fund balances to help pay for ongoing costs, but in the budget are a significant amount of one-time expenditures, which may be capital, or within this discussion a little later, we'll be talking about some operating that is just one-time, meaning that it's only in next year's budget and no promise of future expenditures in 2018 and beyond. So those fund transfers are either half of it is, or more than half of it is the parking, and the other half are help to pay some of the one-time costs. Again, the use of fund balance is a function of the fact that why is that decreasing so significantly? Because even for 2016, we're starting to see those other, especially the first four categories in this area, starting to decline. And that means we're going to have less money left over at the end of the year than we have enjoyed in previous years. Again, it doesn't mean that the economy is necessarily worse in Minneapolis. And in fact, I think most people would say the economy is very good. It's just that we have raised our expectations for what those revenues are going to be compared to previous years.
So, Councilmember Goodman, yes.
I'm wondering about franchise fees being a decrease, given that we added an additional franchisee this year with CenturyLink. For better or for worse, everyone can have their own opinion about that. Why would we see a reduction in franchise fees then?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, good question. It largely revolves around the fact that we have warmer winters. People are using less energy. We charge a flat rate against the gross revenues of Excel and CenterPoint. And so because we have people using less energy, we have less revenue coming in from that particular source.
That great explanation. It's not just about CenturyLink and Comcast. It's also about the utilities and their franchise fees. And we could anticipate then further reductions as we move forward on a zero waste initiative and less energy use generally. That would be a reduction in franchise fees too.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, you're absolutely right.
And I think that's good. I just want to recognize that's a situation.
Right. Another way to think of the franchise fee, that's passed on to the consumer. So that's a fee that they're not having to pay us that comes back through us. So yes, it's good, in fact, that we are getting less from consumers from that point of view, but it also means we're not over budgeting, and if we anticipated fees coming in higher, that would be a weakness in a budget process as you're forecasting what your revenues you have available for use.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is just a chart displaying the same information in graphical form for those people who appreciate colors.
It's a pretty wheel.
Moving from the revenue side to the general fund expense side, I think all of you are aware there are just annual increases. I mentioned generally with inflation, we have some new contracts, but we're going to describe for much of the next several slides what these program change items were that were requested to the mayor and the mayor included in her recommended budget. I'm not going to go through every single line item, and nor do I want to take away from the importance of the department presentations. In those department presentations moving forward, you'll hear more about the rationale behind each of these, but I want to emphasize that these are ongoing expenses as opposed to the one-time discussion that we had earlier on. There's a separate section that we will talk about one time. But generally, in these categories, increased capacity for assessor, also for the city attorney's office, we do have specific requests from the city clerk on changes on how they keep their records. And then for the city coordinator, we have an existing program which we're enhancing for continuous improvement, as well as citywide events are related to some of the major events, sporting and otherwise, coming forward in the next 3 years in the city. Civil rights has additional staff, 3 FTEs related to some increased expenditures. Communications and finance and property services, this is a dedicated person within our department which will be working specifically on CPED budgets, again, additional FTE. Human resources, one of the bottlenecks, I can speak to this from more direct experience, one of the bottlenecks within staff changes for the city has been the ability to reclassify certain positions. This will add more capacity for that. A variety of programs and 2 FTEs in the health department. Another FTE in the internal audit. And then here's more detail on the police budget as well, in addition to the FTEs, some specifics on non-FTE increases. Two FTEs in traffic management, regulatory services because of some changes in how we receive services for the animal shelter, as well as traffic control. Fire with 5 additional sworn at $400,000. So those were the ongoing expenses. Again, without going into details of the specifics of what those programs are, either myself or Ms. Green can certainly handle some high-level questions if there are any about these positions.
In general, Mr. Ruff, does that equal how much of the $16 million of the new expenditures for the general fund in 17 recommended budget? What are these new positions and enhancements valued at versus the inflationary cost?
It's in the neighborhood of $6.7 million, if my memory is correct, Ms. Green. $6.7 million.
Thank you.
One-time expenses, again, in 311 and 911 in the attorney's office. These are more specific programs oftentimes than FTEs. Obviously, if we hire someone, we usually don't want that to be a temporary employment, although that's not always the case.
Councilmember Fry, or is that Goodman? Or oh, okay, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
City coordinator, again, programs including Clean Energy Partnership and Climate Action Plan. A variety of specific programs. Civil rights, $50,000 for the Earn Sick and Safe Time outreach. We have $200,000 in fire for alternative hiring and recruitment, one time, as well as additional resources for human resources. CPED, a variety of programs, including enhancements to the affordable housing efforts within the city, small business efforts, an increase in funding for regulatory services. Again, you'll see some of these same programs, for example, in reg services for traffic control, which will be both ongoing and one-time. Traffic control here hopefully alleviated after this coming year as construction starts to wind down. Health, a variety of programs, and one FTE within this one-time category. Neighborhood and community relations, 2 new programs, police and public works. One that I want to highlight under administration is there is $500,000 in one time for the Downtown East Commons operating. as well as traffic to accelerate really our replacement of the LED technology, which will save us money in the long run. So with that, those are the one-time expenditures within the mayor's budget, if there are any questions. If not,
Councilmember Goodman has a question.
Same question. What's the total of these one-time expenditures, and is that also a general fund, one-time general fund expenditure?
I think Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, all of these that we have highlighted are general fund expenditures. There are some other non-general fund one-time. They're not significant, but there are some other smaller enterprise funds. This was about $6.5 million, Ms. Green, is it?
7. So
$7 million.
$13 million in totally new spending between one-time and ongoing.
And I think, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, some of those one-time items may have been repeats from 2016. So we have to, when we compare actual increased spending, we have to be careful about that particular term because we have to be apples to apples on that comparison.
But in general terms, is it fair to say something in that range? So of the $16 million of new spending that Councilmember Goodman pointed out in the general fund,
and then I think we have to subtract from that, Mr. Chair, the $2.7 million in reduced expenses as well for operating.
Okay. It helps gain a little perspective on how much is just continuing service level operations, just the inflation factor built in, plus the new enhancements of ongoing, which will be on the levy for future years, and these one-time considerations.
Right. So again, on a $500 million general fund budget, those increased operating expenses, or increased program changes, I should say, are the $6.5 million plus the $7 million. Right?
Yeah, and the great opportunity is as we get to the department hearings themselves is when we can really plunge into the details within the department. Councilmember Bender has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So remembering back, you said there was $6.7 million in new ongoing funding, and I'm counting approximately $4.5 million of that in police and fire. Does that sound correct?
That does. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender.
So it seems like the ongoing budget reflects, some small, $2 million of our $1 billion budget in increased ongoing expenditures outside of the police and fire department, and a pretty significant investment of $4.5 million in new ongoing investment in the police and fire department. Does that sound right? Okay, thank you. I think that's helpful just to get some perspective on where the funding is proposed to be going.
Mr. Chair, just a few minutes on the pension. I just again want to highlight the work that the previous city councils have done.
I'm sorry, Mr. Ruff. Before you start that one, I think Councilmember Johnson has.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just curious, piggybacking off of Councilmember Goodman's question, the $13 million specifically in increased spending, what percent of the levy increase is that? Of the 5.5 proposed increase, what would that amount to?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, I think the short answer is if there are specific questions that in terms of how you want to frame the increase in spending, again, the levy is a small part of the overall general fund budget, and so there are some increases. So whether some of those increased expenditures come from sales tax versus property tax, I just like to not make ties between what revenue sources are and what are expenditures. So I think what we can get back to you if the council has specific questions that are framed in the way that you are asking, instead of me off the top of my head giving you an answer that may be close to what is the right answer. I'd rather have some exactness to that response so it can do it justice. So if we can take your question into consideration and then submit in writing some things that would follow up to the committee, if that's acceptable to you, Mr. Chair.
It's fine with me if it helps you, Councilmember Johnson.
Yeah,
and I just want to make sure Latonia is okay with it. She's the one that's going to have to come up with the answers.
Yes, that's fine with me, Mr. Chair. And I just think that the question is really around understanding, what the spending increases have in terms of an impact on the levy, and if there were to be some changes from the council ultimately at what different levels would we see the levy increase drop? And so I think that's the question I'm wondering about. I'm not necessarily concerned about these particular items. I'm just wondering what our menu of options are and ultimately what the impact is at the end of the day for our property taxpayers.
Oh, and Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, maybe I came off sounding too defensive or evasive in that answer. I would just say that if there are choices that you as the council have, so in other words, you could, if you want to reduce spending, you could choose to leave the levy the same place and reduce the sales tax expectation, because you don't want to be in a situation where we are next year where somehow we didn't quite get to the level of sales tax that we had forecast and we have to reduce. And so that's the more detailed discussion, and why I was suggesting that the levy isn't the only place that we look, because there are such a variety of revenue sources and assumptions. And one conversation that the chair and I had not too long ago was the fact that I think my recommendation to the committee would also be to have a session just on revenues. So as opposed to just focusing on expenditure side of the budget, there are significant assumptions that go into the revenues with this general fund budget, in which we have stronger comfort levels and less comfort levels as to how realistic some of those revenues are. And so you may choose to leave the levy the same and then just have a little bit lower expectation on other revenue source. So it's a more complex discussion, I guess, than just simply the discussion of reducing the levy.
Sure, thank you. And I guess that's, I totally understand that, I guess, for just understanding the numbers or how to think about it in terms of equal values. Let's say for $1 million general fund cut, if we were to find $1 million and able to reduce the general fund levy amount by $1 million, what would we expect the percent increase of the levy to go down by? How much is that worth roughly? I've heard in past years, in 2014, I remember the numbers around that I think was like $800,000 ended up being 0.2% or something like that, roughly. So I'm just curious where that's at today with the current tax capacity, the tax base. What would $1 million be in terms of levy increase and where that's at? Sure. And again, this is all about me understanding and being able to compare prospectively as the rate at which increase is happening.
No, and this, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, will be one area where I'll chalk up to I'm the new guy. And so helping me understand what kinds of questions you're looking for is a great benefit. So the more that you ask those type of questions, the more we're able to give you more choices for you as a council. And so we will certainly get back to you on that particular question.
Okay, I'll expect that offline then. Thank you.
Yes.
Councilmember Goodman.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, it's really not all that complicated. The bottom line is there's $6.7 million of totally new spending, $7 million worth of new one-time spending, and we're having to increase our levy capacity or property tax amount by about $16 million. There are some reasons for that. We're seeing less money in charges for services and fines or fees, but there's no real explanation for why we need $13 million more in spending other than we want it. 2 more lead inspectors, 2 more people here, $100,000 for men's sexual health. Look at some of these items, you guys. So, I mean, if you think the levy is in a good spot and you want to blame it on an increase in service plus the parks and roads thing, that is not correct. There's millions more in totally new spending, whether it being one time or not. Some of it is in police, and I totally support that. I don't want to get into what I wouldn't support of all of these things, but there's a lot more money being spent. And since we're getting less money from other places, we have to get more money from property taxes. It's pretty simple, Mr. Ruff. This isn't like super complicated. You need to get back to us later. There's a whole long list here of things that are new. Some, I don't want to point out what are good and what are bad. There's many good things in here. Some of them, though, are not totally necessary. And to blame the increase on police, loss of LGA, or the Parks and Roads plan is not true when there's this much new spending in this budget. And you guys can accept that or not, but it's pretty simple.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Goodman, to take your approach, which I appreciate, remember that the one-time is not funded out of the levy. It is funded out of primarily fund balance. So a reduction in the one-time spending will not result under the current mayor's plan in a reduction in the tax levy unless you choose to redirect that fund balance. That is a choice of yours. One that I would not recommend, because then we get into structural imbalances because you are funding operation costs with fund balance, which is not good for the general overall budget health as well as the bond rating. So what we're down to then is the $6.7 million of new spending, which we have to take again, the $2.7 million of reduced cuts. So the net increase is a $4 million increase. The public safety costs associated with the increase is largely $3.7 million of that $4 million. So if that helps in terms of perspective, I think it's important to just lay out what my understanding would be on the impact on the net on the property tax levy if we just isolate that revenue source as the only revenue source under discussion today.
Councilmember Fry, get up. And Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Why, just give me a rundown again as to why it's worse to spend one-time items on existing, on other outlets than it would be to simply raise the property taxes. So we've got present items that are being funded through one-time items through the one-time items are being funded through the existing balance. Just explain why it's worse to move those items over to existing items.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Fry, it's a healthy discussion. So generally, the short answer is eventually we run out of fund balance.
Right.
And so somewhere down the line, whether it's a year or 2 years or 3 years, we have to double down on the increases if we're going to continue to have those ongoing expenses be ongoing expenses. Otherwise, we have to start laying people off or cutting programs significantly. I would say it's also not just from the bond rating agencies, but from places like the Government Finance Officers Association, which is a best practice to ascribe capital, which can be termed as one time because you can essentially turn the spigot off on capital if you need to for the most part, and fund those with more fund balance, not universally, but help pay for capital, or some of the other programs that the mayor has put forth and that the council has done in the past. For one times, those are programs which are not associated with as much FTEs, and so it's easier to cut off the spending on those particular programs.
And the money is being spent, though, regardless, whether it's in ongoing or not ongoing, it's being spent.
And Mr. Chair, Councilmember Fry, I think it also has to do with the fact that what are the choices for the use of that fund balance? So I think, so for example, one of the places for the Parks and Streets program that we took fund balance was out of IT or intergovernmental, which funds a lot of the information technology. Some of it came out of the self-insurance fund. Mm-hmm. There are competing uses for that money. Part of the reason that we recommended using that last fall is because we had built up enough reserves that we think we could handle the immediate needs. But to the extent that we start taking away more, then you're going to have to find another revenue source for example, tort liability that may occur that self-insurance then can come from.
Thank you.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's kind of fun when we do the budget every year because we get into these kind of big questions. One thing I thought would be helpful is understanding, to your point about the levy. The levy is our capture of our overall tax base from property taxes. So as our tax base grows, if we don't increase the levy, we don't capture that growth. We redistribute it. I think that's one point about the levy. Another point I think is important to remind ourselves annually about the levy is that it compounds over time. So if we keep it lower, like 2 years ago or last year, that has an impact on how much overall funding we have. So we've been spending down fund balance because we kept the levy lower, but now we have less fund balance left to continue to fill that gap. I think of spending fund balance like quitting your job and continuing to pay your mortgage with what you have in your bank account balance, which you can certainly do for how many ever years you have to fund out of your balance, but eventually, to your point, if you're not bringing in revenue, if you're not earning a paycheck, you run out of balance. So I think some of these fundamental things is just good to remind ourselves each year as we tackle certainly the debate about how we should spend money. But there's some of these sort of fundamental questions about, again, how does the city bring in revenue? I think it is actually a little bit complicated about how we make assumptions about which revenue we expect to have next year, and within millions of dollars. Some of these additional spendings are tens of thousands or $100,000, which could easily be covered by changing the assumptions we're making about the revenue that we expect to have in 2017. So I think that there is a little bit of, discretion, certainly a policy decision about how to manage our budget that goes beyond sort of a simple arithmetic calculation. I also wanted to just clarify, so I've just said a lot, you can respond or not. I did want to clarify, since we keep repeating this number, 13 million, if that is an accurate number, or if because of the reduction in spending, so, what's the sort of overall increase in new spending? And I think, again, this distinction between one time and ongoing is important. So that's my question.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Bender, I'd ask Ms. Green just to repeat. So we have $7 million in one-time spending and $6.7 million in ongoing spending. That $6.7 million is offset by $2.7 million in cuts. Okay, so the net is a $4 million increase in ongoing spending, of which the mayor has said is $3.7 million of that is public safety costs. Now, those are round number estimates. The remaining $7 million are one-time expenditures, which are being paid for by either the fact that we expect to have a little bit of money left over, somewhere in the neighborhood of $4.5 to $5.5 million in better than expected revenues and less than expected expenses, which just drops to the bottom line, and some transfers from other funds to help offset those costs, if that answers your question. Mr. Chair, if we can move on, if there's other questions, happy to address them.
Go ahead.
Budget, again, just want to highlight the fact that there's two budget considerations for pensions. One is the closed plans. That is down to $22.3 million. And then we still have pension liabilities on an annual basis. Both of these funds are in the hands of the state of Minnesota through the PERA and other similar types of state-run investments, and all are accounted for in the recommended budget. So, Mr. Chair, I know that I'll talk a little bit later about enterprise funds, but I know a big part of this is not only just how much the levy increases, but